Welcome to the Immigration Therapist Podcast, a podcast for immigration attorneys and therapists that want to learn more about immigration evaluations. So, on today's episode, I want to talk about the difference between trauma evaluations and non-trauma evaluations. So, let's talk about that. What are trauma evaluations? These are your evaluations that we are talking about the trauma. The evaluation is about the trauma. You have to talk about it. So, for example, domestic violence, for obvious reasons. U visa, the client was a victim of a crime. T visa, human trafficking. There's obviously going to be some trauma, some trauma there. And then potentially other kinds of visas, for example, special immigrant. For example, like I listed on a previous episode, the minor that one of the cases was a minor that I evaluated for crossing into the country on his own. Other evaluations may not necessarily have trauma in the background or at all. For example, asylum may not necessarily have trauma in the background. For example, maybe someone's coming to the United States for their political involvement. They received threats, and most likely, that was a bad example, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all the reasons have to do with trauma. Well, here, using that example, the political involvement, maybe, actually, here, I can think of one I did actually once. This case I did that this client was part of the minority political party in their country. And as the presidential change took place, the new president took place, it completely drastically changed the political tone of the country, and it became a very dangerous place for the minority political party in that country. So like I was saying, it didn't really necessarily have trauma. He didn't receive a diagnosis of trauma, so that's why some evaluations may or may not entail trauma, while others absolutely do. Like I said, if anything, talking about the trauma is the evaluation, the basis of the case that the immigration attorney is trying to, make for the client. So let's use the obvious, VAWA, for the domestic violence. So, as we know, abuse can be psychological, emotional, and physical. And in these evaluations, we might cover sexual abuse, for example. So, all of these entail traumatic situations. As we know, as therapists, and this is more for immigration attorneys, trauma is any scenario where a person experienced fear for their life, profound fear, vulnerability, helplessness, and they felt afraid. So this can entail physical fear, meaning they were in a car accident, for example, in a car crash, and they fear dying, their physical safety. But it can also entail emotional, psychological safety. For example, being in a bullying relationship, a work environment relationship. So the fear for your life, it has to do with fear for your well-being. That's probably a better way to say it. So that's what trauma is. It is the profound fear of your well-being. And the thing about trauma is that it can also develop from vicarious trauma. Maybe you didn't experience the trauma yourself, but you saw someone, a loved one, or someone else, you witnessed the trauma that they experienced. So you may experience vicarious trauma, which is just as debilitating as trauma. So the trauma evaluations, like I said, the basis of these evaluations is the trauma. You are talking about the trauma. So as a therapist, what do you do? And here's a dilemma, the ethical dilemma. What do you do? Because you need to talk about the trauma, but at the same time, you're not giving the client the necessary treatment that they need. I believe it's up to us, the therapist, to inform the client, before we get started, that the implications of talking about the trauma, the psychological consequences, the emotional consequences that it'll entail talking about the trauma, while encouraging the client to talk as much as possible, because the more details, the better. So it's that fine line. Again, I do think it's an ethical dilemma of, how far do we go? How much detail is appropriate, both for the client's well-being, but also for the evaluation for their case. So those are trauma evaluations. While, for example, non-trauma evaluations may not necessarily, entail talking about trauma at all, because it didn't happen, the client doesn't have a history of trauma, or because it's not the kind of evaluation. For example, a U visa, which is a client, a victim of a crime here in the United States. You may talk about the background, but the focus of the evaluation isn't the trauma. It's not the trauma that they experienced in the past. Again, you may talk about it if it happened, but that's not the focus. So that's the main difference between trauma and non-trauma evaluations. What you need to focus on. That's why a very basic and foundational, not basic, that's why a very foundational knowledge of what these evaluations are, what kinds of evaluations are. That's why it's very important when we have an immigration evaluations client walk in. We need to be very, very aware. We need to understand. We need to know what these evaluations are, so that we don't talk about something that doesn't need to be talked about, or so that we don't miss an important factor of the evaluation of the case that they're doing. So that's the main difference between knowing, what needs to be talked about on the evaluations, the focus, what you're focusing on. And on a very surface level, that's how I'm categorizing them today. Trauma evaluations versus non-trauma evaluations. So thank you for listening. I hope this helps. And as always, you can find us on social media, on our internet platforms. You can find us on our website, which is centerforimmigrationevaluations.com. And one day I'll get this. Immigration _ evaluations. I totally butchered that. Hold on. So, okay, here. Immigration _ evaluations _ center. Bear with me. I have someone who does my social media. So, yeah, you can tell. So again, immigration _ evaluations _ center. See you on the next episode. Thank you.